In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the rear brakes on this Mazda 6. Let's get started. Use your 21mm socket to remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then remove the wheel. Let's take the cap off of the bleeder screw. I prefer to open it when compressing the piston, which is why I'm going to try to do this now so that it's going to be a lot easier to open this up when I do compress the piston in later. Use a 10mm wrench or socket, crack it free. Snug it up so fluid doesn't leak. Leave that cap off. And now use a 14mm socket or wrench and remove the 2 caliper slider pin bolts. Break them free, remove them. I'm not going to remove this one completely until I break this one free. There we go. Remove both of these bolts. Before removing the caliper, sometimes it helps to stick a screwdriver in here and just pry it in just a smidge. That will push the piston in and basically release some of the pressure. And you can use a little pry bar or screwdriver to remove the caliper. It does have the parking brake cable attached to it, so it can't go very far, but what you can do is flip it up and over here and just kind of let it sit out of your way while you do the rest of the job. Wherever you put it, make sure it's not pulling on the brake hose or bending the line or anything like that. You want this to have some slack in it. Remove your pads. If they're stuck, you can use a pry bar or screwdriver to pry them out. Remove the 2 14mm bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. These can be somewhat tight, so make sure you have some leverage. Before I remove that bottom one, I'm going to break free the top one. That way the bracket is held on. Remove the bolts. Remove the last bolt. Hold the bracket so it doesn't fall. Remove it carefully. Remove the rotor off the hub. If it doesn't come off, mine's already off, but if it doesn't come off, it's most likely seized, in which case you'd want to take a hammer, tap it around until it breaks free. As you can see, there's a lot of rust buildup. We do have to clean this up, so let's do that next. I'm going to take a wire brush. This is not in too bad of condition, so a wire brush should do it. It's pretty flat. If you have a lot of rot buildup, you're going to want to sand this down with a sanding disc of some sort. Don't remove too much material. You still want it to be flat, but you want a clean surface, especially around the center bore of the hub here, so that the new rotor has a clean surface to mount on and it doesn't seize up in the future. Just go around and wire brush all of the rust off. It does not have to look perfect. It doesn't have to look shiny or brand new. You just have to clean it up a little bit. Once you're done cleaning it up, like I said, it doesn't have to look perfect, but I can feel it and it is perfectly flat. It's just stained from the rust. So I'm going to rinse it off with a brake parts cleaner. Give this a light coating of anti-seize. You don't want a lot because otherwise it'll squish out, run on the brake rotor. That's not what you want. You also want to avoid getting it on the lug studs too much. You don't want these to stay dry, so just coat the surface of the hub. That should be good right there. I'm going to let any extra run off as I prepare the caliper. With your caliper bracket on the bench, take the old anti-rattle clips off. Sometimes they're stuck and you need a tool, pocket screwdriver, or a pry bar to pry them out. As you can see, there's quite a bit of rust buildup here, but it is not in really bad shape. I can wire brush this. Sometimes you need to sand it down. Be careful if you do that. You don't want to remove too much material or the pad will wobble around in here. So I'm going to use just a wire brush and clean this off. Just like with the hub, this does not have to look perfect. You just have to get it a nice and flat surface here, which it looks like it's working out pretty well for me with just a wire brush. Clean on the other side of this little ridge as well. The anti-rattle clip needs to sit flat and flush all the way down. Once you think you've cleaned up enough, which honestly is going to be right about here, even though it looks a little bit rusty still, it is as clean as it's going to get unless I sand it down, which I don't need to do. So now I'm going to rinse this off with some brake parts cleaner, just to make sure I get all that dust and debris off. Once it's dried off, put a very thin layer of either silicone paste, high temperature rated silicone paste so that it doesn't melt off, or brake grease if that's what you have. I'm using silicone paste here, and it is rated for high temperatures, so it is safe for brakes. Once you've done that, you can put the new anti-rattle clip on. Make sure you put it on the right way. Obviously, it's not even going to go on the other way, but when you put it on, you want to make sure that the clip, the little hook on the inside, latches in and locks into position. At this point, once this is fully seated, do the same on the other side. Now we have to remove and clean and re-lubricate the slider pins. So remove them one at a time. It is important that you don't mix them up because not only are they different here, this is a square cutout whereas the other one is round. This also has a rubber boot or a rubber bushing here on the end, as you can see. So you don't want to put this in the wrong spot. It is here for a reason, dampens vibrations. So you want to make sure it goes back in the proper spot. Inspect it. If yours were seized, hopefully you can get them unseized. If not, you'll need a new caliper bracket. And then make sure that this boot isn't swollen over time sometimes, especially if the wrong grease is used. They do swell up, and then it prevents it from sliding properly. This ridge also a lot of times gets rusty. As you can see, that is the case here. I'm going to clean this up and make it nice and smooth, rust-free, so that the boot can seal up on it. If the boot doesn't seal up here, water gets in, the whole pin gets rusty. So at this point, I'm going to take my wire brush and try to clean this ridge up a little bit. I'm just going to try and remove the majority of this rust. It doesn't have to look shiny and perfect. Just get all the major buildup off of there, and then we'll add some grease. For the pins, you can also use silicone paste or brake grease if that's what you have. Inspect the boot, make sure it's not torn. If it is, you're going to have to replace it. And now what I like to do is add a small amount of grease inside the boot, especially in the folds of the boot here. This will act as a reserve of grease as the slider pin operates over time. And then I'm going to use the rest of the grease that I have on my brush to put on the pin itself. You can't put a lot on the pin to begin with, just because it's going to get wiped off as you slide it in through the boot. So coat it slightly, but leave the rest in here. Slide the pin in all the way. As you can see, there's air stuck in there at this point, so I'm going to squeeze on the pin, squeeze on the boot. That's going to push out any excess grease and air. At this point, it slides nice and smooth. It's airtight in there. There's plenty of grease, so we can move on to the other one and do the same thing over here. You'll notice this one does not have any bushings on it, so it's just a straight piece of metal that is machined, and you definitely don't want to mix them up. Once you get this one lubricated, get some of that grease in there, and slide this one in as well. Get all the air out, clean off any residue, and this is ready to be installed. Install your rotor. Now, our rotors are not oil coated, but a lot of them will be. So what you want to do is get a rag and some brake parts cleaner. And even with these that are not oil coated, it's a good idea to clean them off just in case you got any grease or fingerprints on them. Wipe the surface on both sides. On the back side, I'm going to spray some brake parts cleaner on my rag and just go over the entire surface. There we go. That's clean. Install the caliper bracket over the rotor. Have your bolts ready and start them in. Just going to bring them in as far as I can by hand, since it's very easy in this case. If your threads on your bolts are really corroded, clean them up a little bit. And if you're going to put anything on them, use thread locker, not grease or anti-seize. The torque for these is 45 foot-pounds. That's one. And two. Next, you want to install the pads. The inner pad is going to get the wear indicator on the bottom. Slide it in at an angle. Usually it's easiest to do it this way. just like that. Do the same to the outer pad. Make sure these move around freely. They're not supposed to be stuck in here. If they are stuck, something is wrong. It's not cleaned up well or something isn't seated, and they will get stuck as you apply the brakes. So make sure they're smooth. To push this caliper piston back, you're going to need this special tool. If you don't have this, the little cube with the tabs on it, you could use needle nose pliers. Just be very careful with that. I'm going to put a little collection tube over here that goes into my receptacle. Crack the bleeder screw free. This is just so I don't make a mess on the floor or have to get a huge collection bucket just for this. And at this point, you're going to want to twist and push at the same time on the caliper. Turn clockwise once you get that cube seated in there, and that should get your piston wound back in. I'm going to go all the way in until the piston's fully depressed. Okay, that's fully depressed at this point. It has plenty of space for the new pads, so we can close up the bleeder screw. If you didn't use one of these tubes, you're going to want to let it drain for just a couple seconds to make sure there are no air bubbles in here. Obviously, make sure the bleeder is pointing up so that air naturally rises to the top. Tighten it up. Remove anything that you had on here. Clean up the mess, and let's reinstall. Don't forget to plug up the bleeder screw with the rubber cap if you still had one. This prevents debris from clogging it up. And now slide the caliper over the bracket and the pads. Make sure it's seated here and the slider pins line up. Have your bolts ready, and let's snug them up. Let's start them in and then snug them up. The torque for these is 25 foot-pounds, so they're really not super tight. So if you're doing this with a power tool, don't go too hard on them. They're not supposed to be extremely tight. Once again, 25 foot-pounds. Okay, ready? There we go. At this point, the brakes on this side are done. Do the same to the other side. Pump up the brake pedal top off the master cylinder, and let's install the wheels. Let's get the wheel back on. Make sure it's seated. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern, and then also in a cross pattern, torque them to 85 foot-pounds. .85 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them all. Take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.